You might always not. I want to get class, you waste.
Okay, so we're going to read two cards, or read a standard in two cards, and ask you to compare them. So you need to take down both cards.
So one will be a card that, and then one will be a card that affirms, and one will be a card that negates.
And the topic is economic sanctions ought not be used to achieve foreign policy objectives. Okay, so economic sanctions are policy tools used by governments where they cut off trade to a target nation, and so the sender nation is the government which is cutting off trade. The target nation is the nation whose trade is cut off, and they do this in order to influence the behavior of the target nation. So basically, the idea is it's like, if you don't stop doing this behavior, then we're going to hurt your economy, which is going to suck for you. And so the question is whether or not those should be used as a behavior.
Okay, so you in the Kempner shirt, can you explain what the topic of this question?
Yeah, it's questioning if we should use economic sanctions to achieve foreign policy objectives. And so what that means is like we stop trading with one nation because we want them to do something like diplomatic or like stop making weapons or something like that.
Everyone's good with that? Okay. So the standard is the kinds of separations, big surprise. So first, the affirmative parts. Economic sanctions decrease the GDP per capita in the target country. Adino Addix writes, a newspaper report on the effects of sanctions against Iraq concluded that those sanctions have created a small group who are still doing very well, but that the overwhelming majority of Iraqi citizens' income has been so devalued that few can afford a helping of chicken at the local equivalent of KFC. Treating civilians in such circumstances effectively as outlaws is the cruelest form of indifference. This can have huge effects on terrorism, as the well-being of a country's economy affects the motivation of terrorists, as it is a source of dignity and thus its loss creates anger. Drew Shaw confirms the hypothesis. A 1% increase in the GDP per capita of a country decreases the expected number of transnational terrorist incidents within the country by 19.3%. A 1% increase in the average GDP per capita of the country's top 8 export destination countries decreases the expected number of transnational terrorist incidents within this country by 47.5%. This means that economic sanctions increase terrorism, which is the worst impact since it is a non-government, since terrorists are non-governmental actors and thus cannot be predicted and defended against the way that state-sponsored violence can be. And then the negative. Economic sanctions tie up the target country's resources, decreasing their focus on sponsoring terrorist groups. Thomas McNamara writes, Gaddafi, who's the leader of Libya, didn't conform to the demands of the Security Council and spent years attempting to get out from under the Council's sanctions without complying. The political energy expended on this task took Libya out of the terrorism game for a decade. Since the imposition of the sanctions in 1992, Libya is not known to have been involved in any international acts of terror. Terrorism by Libya has been starkly reduced by UN sanctions. This example proves that economic sanctions effectively end state-sponsored terrorism, which is the worst type of terrorism since state-sponsored terrorists have more resources and thus greater destructive capability.
Okay, so
Okay, so so we're going to be asking you to analyze which card is better. So what what questions do you want to ask in order to do that analysis? You in the light blue shirt.
Wait.
Do you have any questions?
Oh, no.
Yeah, but I'm asking
Oh,
you.
no.
Okay. So you are completely fine with doing the analysis without any further questions?
I just had I was just wondering the author for the newspaper, the first card.
Okay. That's not a newspaper. It's Adino Addix.
Okay.
Do you want to ask me the source then?
Yeah.
Okay. He is he's the professor of public and constitutional law at Tulane University Law School, and he was writing a human rights report.
Michael, wait outside.
Okay.
Don't be late.
Are there any other? Who else has an idea of what they want to ask?
Remember, we're gonna have you compare these cards and prove which one links to the standard minimizing suffering better. So you should probably utilize this time to establish.
What year were these cards? Or what were the years for each card?
The years for each card. So Addis was writing in August of 2003. Shaw was writing in 2004. He was writing in 2004. That doesn't say anything about study. McNamara was writing in 2007, but that also doesn't say anything about time period which is actually describing. So, further questions? He was the Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs and the U.S. Ambassador to Colombia. I don't know what time he was asking. There's the one behind.
So the second comment to be affirmative was Shaw.
Yes.
Yeah, so what are, who is current affirmative?
So it's Juan Lee and Drew Shaw, and they're professors of political science at Pennsylvania University.
If you want to ask about specifics of the cards, now would be the time to do so.
So, the first part that I remember is saying that it decreases human needs.
It's saying that it decreases the GDP per capita. So like everyone's making less money.
And then the second one is saying that it causes more terrorism.
The second one says that an increase in the GDP per capita of a country decreases terrorist incidents.
You have a question?
Yeah, what was the nation that was used in the negative card?
Libya. Writing about Gaddafi.
The Latin card is to the negative.
America.
Did you see that the second card is in the is saying that an increase in GDP decreases terrorism?
Yes. Hannah and then Bria.
What does the shop part say?
The Shaw part says a 1% increase in GDP per capita for the country decreases the expected number of transnational terrorist incidents within that country by 19.3%. And then another 1% increase in the average GDP per capita of the country's export destinations, so their people they trade with, decreases the number of terrorist incidents by 47.5%.
How did they get those particular numbers?
That is a very good question. So they were using a model of 112 countries using data from 1975 to 1997.
What was the sample size?
112 countries. I don't have information on where those countries were. I'm just going to read it again if you're not more specific. Okay. So McNamara says that Gaddafi spent so much time trying to get the sanctions repealed that he wasn't spending money or time like sponsoring terrorism, getting his government to sponsor terrorism. Yeah.
What does it mean in the second affirmative card about in 8 economic port cities, about 47% decrease in terrorism?
Okay, that is a good question. The reason I included that part of the card was to show that the trading or to show that it mattered who you were trading with. So if you're cut off from trading with a very wealthy country, such as the U.S., then then the average GDP per capita of the rest of your countries would decrease, right? So because if it's like the U.S. and you're trading with Colombia and like Venezuela and whoever, then if you cut off the U.S., average decreases. And so that would, and so my implication was that that would increase terrorism. But the part actually says that an increase in GDP per capita decreases terrorism.
I just don't know what it means by like 8 economic port cities. So that's like
8 economic export countries. So like the countries to whom you export your goods. So like the United States exports like a lot of oil. We actually do. To like countries like Europe or to countries in Europe. So we could say our top 8 exporters, so the countries that we send the most oil to, are like the UK and Germany and Spain and 5 more. So the countries that we send our products to.
so terrorism decreases in our country because of those countries, or decreases in those countries because we trade.
It decreases in our country because we trade with those countries. Or at least that is what. When their GDPs rise, our incidences of terrorism decrease.
Thank you.
That study was like taken in 1975 to 1987.
The data was gathered in that time.
And how did they develop the correlation between, in the negative card, how did they develop the correlation between an increase in GDP of a country and an increase, or a decrease of terrorism rather, in the export country? Like, how did they determine that those two things were necessarily related and not just?
Okay, sorry. They looked at multiple other variables, and when they held, so like they looked at variables like globalization, they looked at economic development, and when they held all those other variables constant, so they eliminated, and by holding those other variables constant, they eliminated them, there was an increase in GDP, or there is a decrease in GDP that correlated to it. I forgot what I just said. There's an increase in GDP that correlated with a decrease in terrorist incidents. I don't have it specified, I can't specify exactly what the variables that hold in constant were. So, that's good.
To be clear, what is resolution?
Economic sanctions ought not be used to achieve foreign policy objectives.
What is the standard?
Minimizing suffering.
What is the affirmative? What? Minimizing suffering. Let's say it all together. Minimizing suffering. What is the affirmative position?
Decrease GDP per capita.
What?
Economic sanctions produce more justice.
Okay, so what is the impact to suffering?
We suffer more.
More terrorist attacks equal more suffering. More terrorist attacks.
Like the economic sanctions on them, it hurts their economy, and because it hurts their economy, and with them trading less, I guess there's more terrorist attacks, and that hurts us as well.
So it's concerned with terrorism. Terrorism obviously makes people suffer. What is the negative position?
Terrorism.
Say that louder.
An increase in GDP decreases terrorism.
That is in fact the affirmative position.
Yeah.
I mean, the other way around.
Well, the affirmative position, there are 2 parts to the affirmative position. So there's one part that says that economic sanctions decrease GDP, and then there's another that said they gave the impact of that. So then I read something on the negative. You got what I read on the negative.
The support for terrorism decreases because of the focus from the colors that everybody seems to use hard?
That is the affirmative again. Because like, so economic sanctions cause problems, terrorism increases.
The second part says that the lower the GDP, reduces.
Sorry, go ahead.
The second part states that when you use economic sanctions, the state-sponsored terrorism increases.
Okay, that's correct. I just realized we asked you guys the wrong question. What does the negative, which is the third part that I read, and I said negative before it, say? Brian?
That's the one about Gaddafi, right?
Yeah.
It was basically saying that since economic sanctions were imposed onto Libya, Gaddafi was fighting them for so long, he didn't get past the terrorism actually was decreased from, like, output terrorism from Libya, and inside of Libya was decreased from the economic sanctions.
Yes. So those are the affirmative and negative positions. And now we're going to split y'all into groups and discuss them.
So before we split you into groups, some of you will be making arguments for why the affirmative card or the affirmative position links to the standard better. The impacts are bigger. You minimize suffering more. And some of you will be arguing that the negative meets the standards better. You minimize suffering better when you negate. This will involve not only evidence comparison like we went over in the previous lesson, but what I want you to do this time I want you to also isolate the parts of the card that explicitly link to minimizing suffering. So in one of the cards, it'll be like terrorism. And I want you to isolate those sentences. So I want you to think about these cards on two levels. First, which parts of the card enable the card to link to a standard of minimizing sufferings? Which part of the card speaks to and describes what suffering is going to occur or be minimized? The second part of this exercise is you're going to isolate how this is warranted, and that's when the methodology stuff that we discussed last time will come into play. So someone tell me the two parts of the card you will be specifically looking at. Michael.
The two what?
The two features of the card you'll be looking at in order to show that your card is not only better, but links to the standard better. Can someone help him out who is doing that?
I can't help him.
Okay.
Girl in the aqua shirt.
Basically, we want to see which cards are better warranted.
Which, we want to divide that into two levels. What two levels are we looking at?
Like, I guess, the credentials, and then,
I'm pretty sure I wasn't making clear enough. Okay, so there are two things I want you to analyze when justifying why your card is better and links to the standard or outweighs in linking to the standard. The first is in essentials, we'll analyze the warrant or sort of how the methodology or conclusions from the cards are problematic. The second, I want you to isolate what are the impacts in the empirics. What is the conclusion of the cards? What is the card trying to prove? How does that link to the standard? And why is your card better at linking to the standard? Why is minimizing suffering, why are you winning that with your card more so than the other one?
So, like we said, half of you will be saying that the affirmative is the better card, the better link to the standard. Half of you will be saying that the negative is. And we are just going to count you into groups of three. And each group of three needs to come up with two reasons why they're assigned sides that are like said. So we will assign the groups as well.
2, 3. the rest of you on this side, what? What, 3 people? 1, 2, 3.
Do you wanna do beside all of them negative?
1, 2, 3.
Okay.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
2, 3, affirmative. 1, 2, 3, affirmative.
Is that unclear?
Affirmative.
You 3, you 3,
1, 2, 3,
you 3, and you 3.
Okay, so 1, 2, 3, affirmative, and you have a group yet?
Yeah, that's what I think.
Here, affirmative.
Are we negative?
We'll go right here.
Have fun with
Hey, you weren't that bad.
Always have that flash driving? Yeah. I had a flash drive, like, down the back and you scared of the screen. That's probably great. You have to you know,
Okay.
It has like increased trees, so it's like
right, Jack.
You know what I'm talking about. Why is it there? What kind of white flowers is that? They make this stuff there.
It's hard to run the drop box.
They are I'm not so
Wait, we're affirmative, right? We're good. I was just making sure. So we're saying economic safety are good.
They are.
What do we do with students? Exactly.
The compensation and the you is that they're not making enough money.
There's not really any Wait, what was it? Remember that one? Yeah, but we have to say why, another reason why these areas have been why, right? Yeah. Rather than just these points down.
Be more specific.
I mean, it's soon after 9/11, but I could have said something. I mean, 2 years. That's when like Bush's plan really went and happened. So rather, it could be from our response, and how like we didn't ever respond their aid.
Taking from the negative.
Oh, you mean well, like how we started more.
It shows how economic
When
safety
we were responsible
produced for
I'm not sure about it. 2001 we started war. 2003 we were fighting all Iraq. So the cars
And then also another thing could be like, since they saw that America's so like easy to attack, easy to attack, they just throw the plane into a building and they're more motivated to attack.
We've been here 7 years.
I wasn't like crazy.
okay. So my analysis in the first slide, I guess it shows how economic safety is used to faster.
You're gonna want to show why.
They gave like
What do you mean?
Warrants, impacts, and First of all, I mean, it's pretty old, and that was at a very time
they're both good by
increase all GDP.
especially if you don't have if you don't expose economic safety,
Okay.
like this would like
Like it was done for all these countries starting in 1975. Like the complete worldview of terrorism changes really fast.
That's what it's called.
The first one was like,
That's what's like it's kind of relevant.
I don't know. But not to like there was something more like what is that? And the golf course and the wars like Iraq, whatever.
Well, yeah, you're right.
So it could be because of the war, like terrorism.
But why? I guess we have to find out why.
But the state terrorism decreased.
Why people even think about using technology. I guess they did that because she stopped doing classes. So I guess.
So wait, what?
Like
Like there are jobs in all these countries that like decrease doesn't mean the opposite. Even if they're like even if that was their card like their card starts like because all the wars that are made, like the Gulf War, Cold War, the wars in like Iraq and Iran. Did anyone get the date when it ended? So, but also, after that, with like 9/11 and wars in Iraq and Iran, that was also this. Map America. We do have to respond to this. That's how it weighs because it actually
It shows that like other countries are trying to like get rid of these economic
because it was in 2007. It was
more up to date.
so after the war, after like 9/11.
Yeah, because after there was like wars that are going on.
And plus, if you want to analyze technology, that's your Secretary of State. So he knows what's going on. Ambassador to Colombia? Yeah, so I heard Cuba. I'll be like, either way, I'm ambassador. Second,
No, but we're saying why this next one is good.
I know, but like I'm thinking of responses so we can kind of get ambassador
didn't have enough time to read.
Oh, it's only one example.
Yeah,
What we're trying to say, what we're trying to have
this could be just a good option if no one else is going to do that.
is like what I was saying. Think about how
history and patterns.
what I was thinking.
That's how the concept.
I'm saying like even if they say
So
there would be some
I
patterns.
guess like okay with all the violations, right violations, and being okay with the right violation, I guess that acts like something. So yeah, we're giving like so we have to take down what we need to separate
We're going negative. We pointed out the problem with the affirmative problem, like affirmative arguments. So now we're trying to make arguments so the affirmative might make against the negative position so we can defend it.
Okay, so that's right. When you say problems, reasons why it's better.
Yeah. Their first part, it's not a problem. Just because the GDP decreases in terrorism. Maybe terrorism increases because of like as a response to the wars we started in 2003, the war in Iraq, and also it could be like a response. Terrorists could be like, oh well, 9/11 was successful, so we can be successful also. And so that could be why.
Who's ready? Anyone ready? No? Okay, you have 2 more minutes.
You need to be explicit in your character. You need to say share or more obvious than causal. So the point isn't just to indict, they're actually so yeah, exactly. Just like with the date. Obviously you wouldn't want to make the argument saying your car would be subject to the same fate.
So you said ours directly Dolphins tried so like for so long to steal the same thing. He had no he didn't have time to and he didn't have as many resources to
The low GDP, the low GDP is reflected. So the second time. I'm sure. So that's an idea.
how critical we did it all. Hey, wait, the second card wasn't here for that. No four.
Yeah, but they didn't have a good the study they made.
So it didn't go like that. It's like this was written.
So I was really to get off the
2 minutes. When's the problem? So, okay, I read some up.
That's supposed to be done.
So we're going to ask each of you to give the best reason you can come up with for why you prefer your card, or if you're given side, we're just going to go alphabetic. Okay, so Vivian, your affirmative group.
So we said that negative card was just a logical step because it was never able to prove whether or not Gaddafi's sponsorship actually lowers terrorism, and if the economic sanctions were the reason for those low terrorism, so it never really specified that, so we did not really link the two things together.
Okay, so why Gaddafi's sponsorship affected terrorism and why economic sanctions affected terrorism or affected Gaddafi? And I don't know, you guys should be writing these down. We're probably not gonna have, yeah, you guys should be writing. And then for the negative, Carlos, your group?
We stated that the negative directly links into minimizing suffering, whereas the affirmative just shows that when you negate the resolution, that suffering is increased.
Can you say that again?
Like the affirmative cards show how when you negate the resolution, or when you use economic sanctions, suffering goes up via terrorism. Whereas the negative directly states that when you use economic sanctions, that terrorism goes down, and suffering decreases. Does that make sense?
Okay, so one's a comparison from between the negative and the affirmative. So that would be the affirmative because it just shows that terrorism is relatively higher. And then, so one shows a difference from the status quo. So like the negative shows that terrorism actually decreases, 0, and the affirmative just says that terrorism is comparatively lower. Right. Okay.
Is that what you're saying?
I don't know.
Well, maybe it would help if you're a little bit more detailed in your answer. So instead of saying the affirmative card, say like, what about the affirmative card?
Okay. well, the Shaw card shows that when you use economic when you don't use economic sanctions, the GDP goes up. Sanctions.
I got you.
Okay. Therefore, terrorism goes down. But that only. Okay. Yeah.
Someone else from your group help you out? I assume you collaborated.
I guess with the negative side, it shows how negating actually minimizes suffering, while with the affirmative side, it just says how negating will maximize suffering. Pretty much what it is.
Why is that a reason to negate?
Well, the negative side actually goes into it corresponds with the standard, while the affirmative card just says negating doesn't go with the standard.
Well, so the affirmative's job is to show that the use of that we should use economic sanctions, right? So they would want to show why using economic sanctions increases suffering, which is why we shouldn't have them, which is why I prefer. And yeah, the rhetoric of the standard is minimizing suffering, but the implicit link in saying that having economic sanctions increasing suffering means that we shouldn't have economic sanctions to decrease suffering. Am I misinterpreting your argument?
No, I don't think so.
So we're gonna go to another affirmative and then we'll come back and see if we have another result. Okay, so affirmative, Paloma, Chris, and Jose. You guys go for that. Oh, you're on the floor now. Sorry, I couldn't see you. You guys. Do you have a reason why you would prefer the affirmative card?
But you had so many questions when you were asking. You came up with a reason at the end.
Oh, was it the source?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so the Shaw card, you should prefer that one because he would know more about the topic. So, because I'm a professor of political science.
Okay, and what is the other card source?
A professor of law, and then that's what is the Secretary of State for religion.
I mean, I think there's something there. You need to include analysis for why, Apollo's professor would seem to know more about political science than, who's the other one? Assistant Secretary of State. Some governors, because the Assistant Secretary of State. But yeah, it's good. You're looking at the right place.
Yep.
Okay.
Oh, wait, no, we're gonna, can you guys come up with a reason why negative's better yet?
Well, the negative impact.
Well, I want to say that I feel like the validity of the second card is outdated, and yeah.
Why is it outdated?
Because a lot has changed over 15 years from when the card was, the data was collected.
Well, what's changed?
Well, I mean,
The world.
9/11.
The world.
Well, what about the world? What about 9/11?
9/11 happened, and the war between America and Iraq.
Okay, how does that change the nature of terrorism? Why would that make the study?
I thought terrorism was at an all-time peak.
Terrorism is at an all-time peak. So why would terrorism being more prevalent now mean that studies of terrorism 15 years ago are irrelevant?
Because the circumstances have changed.
Well, what about the circumstances?
Well, terrorism has gone up significantly since I'm not sure what you're doing.
Well, I'm trying to get you to explain why just because terrorism has gone up post 9/11 somehow means that studies of terrorism are significantly different, such that just because there's less terrorism 50 years ago, that is important enough to not look at any analysis studying terrorism from 15 years ago. So there needs to be, what's missing is explanation as to why, just because terrorism has increased since 9/11, that means that studies of terrorism 15 years ago no longer matter.
I guess like the goals of the terrorists have changed, like post 9/11 and pre 9/11. So I guess only studies that are post 9/11 would matter since they're the same goals.
Interesting. The goals of terrorism have changed. I think that's an interesting avenue to go down. I don't know anything about terrorism or anything, but you need to justify why, again, a change in goals in terrorism entails that terrorism with different goals 15 years ago means we don't care about studies from that time.
It's a good place to go. So now we're back to the affirmative side. The group with blue shirt. Yep.
For the shop part, we said that the pool or whatever was, that was the numbers were 112 countries. So we said the pool is large enough so where we can like infer how the what fish were, and we thought we debated whether the day was low enough, but we didn't really think that that post 9/11, pre 9/11, the numbers are really changing. So even if the goals are different, they don't really relate to each other.
Okay, so that's good, like that you're thinking of, well, the number of countries started, but remember we said that all of this analysis has to be comparative, so what's the comparison there?
We didn't really get a good argument for the gift card, but we were thinking that it might be flawed because Gaddafi really only cared about his personal life, I guess, where his goals aren't really to try to do more about how his lifestyle is, I guess. We really think about that.
Okay, that is again like a good like second reason why you prefer comparative, but the first reason is still missing something, because your first reason you said, they studied 112 countries, that's a lot of countries. Well, maybe the negative studied 300 countries, right? So why does the fact that the affirmative studied 112 countries make the affirmative better in this case?
I don't know.
Well, how many, so think of it along so you're saying the condition that you really like about your card is that it's studying multiple countries. So you want to be comparative to that condition. So then that leads you to ask, well, how many countries is in the affirmative card? Or in the negative?
No,
Yeah.
I don't think we had an answer for that, did we?
there was one, right? It was just Libya.
There was just one country. So.
Can you explain to him that more clearly? To the person in the Arab pistol shirt, can you explain to him why it's one country?
One country makes it so, I guess the pool would be a lot like smaller, so I guess opinions or whatever are a lot more meaningful.
Okay, you're down the right avenue. Okay, so when we say 112 countries, and I think that at this point we would read the negative part only studied one country. Why? What flaws does that open up the negative to, the negative part to, that the affirmative part doesn't have?
The affirmative part has more opinions, so there's a lot larger statistic on what's right or wrong, I guess.
Okay, so let's say I said this. There's person A and person B. Person A is smarter than person B because person A has an IQ of 130. Have I done my job to show that person A is smarter than person B? Yeah. Why?
Did you ever provide the IQ of person B?
Yeah, we don't know the other person's IQ. Would it be sufficient to say person A is smarter than person B because person A has an IQ of 130 and person B likes to eat sandwiches? No. Why would that not be doing its job to be comparative?
Because they're unrelated.
They're unrelated. You want to make a comparison based along the same lines. It would make sense to say person A is smarter than person B because person A has an IQ of 130 and person B has an IQ of negative 800 or something. So, when thinking about, when you say my card is better than their card because my card discusses 100, or is based upon a study of 112 countries, what is required to make that comparative?
The
number of other countries.
And say that louder.
Michael, say it louder.
Oh, the number of other countries.
The number of other countries in what?
Studies, there are studies.
And yeah, and then other studies?
Yeah.
That what you said, okay. So, can you explain, how to best make the argument that, the affirmative card is better?
the number of countries that were interviewed is a lot more substantial than the negative card, because the negative card only has one country being interviewed about it, so I guess the right way to say is that the intelligence, I guess, is not the opinions of the first card are more substantial because there's a larger pool, and that makes it so.
Well, you have successfully explained that the affirmative has more data than the negative, which is really good. And oftentimes we won't, and it would be good to give a warrant for why having more countries is better. But we can click on that. So think about a warrant for why having more countries is better, and we're gonna go back to negatives. Have you guys done? Like,
Okay, so to like the beneficial or like rather to get yes, for defending negative card, we stated that it tells you like the direct correlation between like why the terrorism went down, and so far it tells you like that Gaddafi was like busy fighting the sanctions, and because he was too busy fighting the sanctions and he couldn't directly fund that terrorist group, so terrorism like inherently went down because of that like direct correlation. Whereas the affirmative card never gives you the correlation as to like sure like GDP goes up and terrorism goes down, but what happens when the GDP goes, or rather when GDP goes up and when GDP goes down and terrorism goes up, it never tells you what happens when GDP goes up. Like it never has a correlation as to why terrorism would go down. Yeah, so whenever you're like comparing, just off of this, whenever you're comparing the methodologies of the affirmative card and the negative card, like the negative card actually gives you a methodology of presenting these variables, and then from the process of elimination, it comes to the GDP, and is what correlate, or the affirmative card rather doesn't present any reason why they have these statistics per se, whereas the negative card sort of offers the variable methodology.
okay. So the negative card gives an explanation.
Yeah.
The affirmative card doesn't. Yeah, that's good.
So I have two suggestions. First is that they are showing a correlation, they're not showing a causal relationship. But I think you just mix up words there. And then the second is you can make it more powerful by saying why this reading reject their cards and prefer yours. We don't want to just say mine actually explains the causal link and theirs does not. Theirs is just a correlation. Next. You want to say where that is the reason why yours is true, it is proven, or it's false, it's not linked to the standard. Yeah, that's good.
Which groups have left to go? Have not gone. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. We are out of time. So you guys have the affirmative and negative, or the reasons for affirmative and negative, kind of some of the other reasons on your close. So go ahead and look through those, and based on that, the exercise for